I was telling you about some letter writing campaigns. I used one illustration, and I'll pick up a couple more and try not to drag them out too much. The next one I want to tell you about was some 2 or 3 years later, when Newsweek magazine published an article on the French Red Hand. And it was a fairly long article in which they pointed out the horror, how terrible it was, that these wonderful independence-seeking Arabs, representing the FLN, or the Provisional Government of Algeria, which was, of course, in Cairo, and since this was a provisional government of a revolutionary group that was out to get independence for their country, Algeria, why, naturally, they had business affairs had to be taken care of, so these FLN representatives had to be going around over Western Europe on their business, and how they were subject to being assassinated by these French army officers who were members of the Red Hand. That this horrible French army was terrible anyway, and of course the great communist drive during all this time was to break down the prestige of the French army. The French army was doing a terrifically good job in Algeria, and at this time was the strongest military or physical force against communism in the whole world, for many reasons. One was what they had learned in Indochina, especially in Vietnam up to 1954. Fighting the FLN communists in the sands of Algeria wasn't too different from fighting the Viet Cong communists in the swamps of Vietnam, so far as they were concerned. And the thing that made the French army so good was that they knew who their enemy was. They had learned in Vietnam in 52, 53, and 54 that their enemy was the United States. And they knew it in Algeria, which very few other people did. It was our government. And it's rather interesting that the one man representing our government, Colonel Edward Lansdale, who did more than any other one man to drive the French out of Indochina and turn North Vietnam over to the communists, and all Vietnam if they wanted it, the man who distributed all kinds of leaflets by the tens and hundreds of thousands to the natives of Vietnam, saying, don't you fight the communists. Don't let the French sucker you into that or beguile you or fool you into that. Remember, your enemies are the French. You must fight the French and drive them out of Indochina. And once you've driven them out of Vietnam, then if you want to fight the communists, that's up to you. But your enemies are the French. And of course, that was the whole communist plan. The Vietnamese natives had to be sold this idea. Instead of remaining loyal to the French government and settlers and fighting the communists, and they could easily have stopped the communists, the whole drive by our State Department was to try to turn them as far as possible against the French. And the man that took the lead was Edward Lansdale, then colonel, now Major General, and at the insistence of Henry Cabot Lodge, over the protest of people in our military, Edward Lansdale has just been sent to Vietnam as a chief assistant and helper in the picture under Lodge. He's referred to as our man in Vietnam. And the people who knew that best that counted were the French army. They knew all about Lansdale and what he had done. They knew about what our whole State Department had done, and they were well aware of what was happening in Algeria and who their enemies were. They were being betrayed by their own government. They were being horribly misrepresented by our press and our government, and we're still doing a terrific job. The French army, they weren't labor battalions. They were soldiers. They were fighters. But as fast as the FLN would tear things up, they'd put them back together. They rebuilt roads. They reestablished rail lines. They reestablished telephone lines, rebuilt schools that were destroyed by the FLN, and they did a grand job in every way. And, of course, they were able to wipe the FLN right off the map anytime they were allowed to, and then a new guerrilla band would be brought in and started up. Well, anyway, as the thing went on, was carried on for a few years, and the real enemy, the only real enemy of the FLN, the communists, in their effort to take over Algeria, was the French army stationed in Algeria. And it became quite an effort on the FLN's part to capture, mistreat, maim, exhibit, or just plain assassinate French army officers. And not just in Algeria. but anywhere they could do it, in France or anywhere else. And the French army and its officers could get no help from their government. The French government was completely communist-dominated, even before de Gaulle, for the last 2 or 3 premierships before that. And so eventually, in self-protection, the French army officers founded the Red Hand, which was an organization to try to help to protect each other. That's all it's for. And to maintain as much as they could the strength necessary to try to save Algeria from being taken over by the communists and the French settlers and the native Muslims from being massacred. So Newsweek published this article about how horrible it was that this assassination bunch called the Red Hand of these horrible French army officers were assassinating these wonderful independence-seeking Arab leaders of this drive for independence who had to be going about their business in Central Europe and knew that they might be, in Western Europe, might be assassinated at any time. And typical of how bad the picture was, that this great leader, Si Mustafa, the most important of these Arab leaders of the Arab independence movement, had to be going about to different parts of Europe because they had to buy supplies and provisions and get arms and all of this, and that he knew and said that he was top on their list, and that he was sure that he would be assassinated sooner or later by the French Red Hand, and how terrible it was. And this all built up to this glorification of Si Mustafa and the horror of having him doing all of this noble work subject to the threat of immediate assassination at any time. So we told our members to write Newsweek and tell them that, wittingly or not on their part, that they had the story exactly 100% backwards, and it was serving communist purposes terrifically, which it did. I'll come to that in a minute. That the threat of assassination was entirely against the French army officers. All they were trying to do was protect themselves, not against any of the members of this provisional government or any of its associates that were going about in Europe at all. And the typical of the way the article was backwards was their glorification of Si Mustafa as an independence-seeking Arab, when the truth was that Si Mustafa was a German communist named Mueller. So our members began to write. At this time, Newsweek had not been sold to the Washington Post crowd. Newsweek belonged to Malcolm Muir. The letters began to come in there, and our members began to get letters back saying, well, we don't know where you got this information. You're all wrong. Our articles are always carefully researched and checked, and our facts are right and Mrs. Right. And how on earth, to show you how silly this is, how on earth could anybody, you say that Si Mustafa, the Arab leader Si Mustafa is a German communist, how on earth could anybody mistake a German for an Arab? So our members write us, say, what do we do now? This is the answer we're getting. Well, in the meantime, enough of our members were writing. We do have a number of influential members whose names were well enough known that when the letters came in, it went straight to Malcolm Muir. So he called up a few. He wrote some himself, and he called up some. He called up one man who's well known to almost every one of you and said, I got this letter from you, or our editorial office did, about our article on the French Red Hand. He said, I don't know what's happened here, or who's stirring all this up. He said, that article was researched properly, as ours always are, and checked, and it was correct, and we published it, and for 3 weeks, nobody said a thing. He said, then just all of a sudden, in about 3 weeks, all hell breaks loose, and we're flooded with letters about it being all wrong. As somebody's stirring up something, and where are you getting this information? Where do you get this idea? And this friend said, well, now look, this member, a friend of mine, he said, now look, never mind where we're getting it. It's from sources we believe are correct, we believe are true, and you better look further into it. And that's all he would say. And the minute he hung up the phone, he called me up and gave me the conversation verbatim. And we were already writing our members to write back and say, tell them never mind anything else, that we are still correct, the information is correct, you know it is. And we said to our members, look, you know we would not have told you this or given you this information to act on unless we were absolutely sure of our ground, which of course we wouldn't. So you write back and tell them you're sure. Well, there were enough different members of ours whose names were recognized by Muir that he felt he had to pay some attention to, that told him the same thing, that they figured they had to do something about it. And I'll cut this through now as short as I can. The net result finally was that about 6 or 7 weeks from the time we started the campaign, we had letters from Newsweek. I had one because I had written them too. I tried to write a letter whenever we ask our members to. I don't have to because the members will send in letters they receive. But this one came addressed right to me, and it said, "Dear Mr. Welch, we published this letter in the bulletin the first month after it came. Dear Mr. Welch, in view of the pride we take in the careful research and objectivity of our articles, it is with real embarrassment, in answer to your letter of December 12, what it is, we must confess that you were right and we were wrong. For one thing, C. Mustafa, the supposed Arab independence seeker, does turn out to be, as you said, a German communist named Mueller," and so forth. And we published that. Now, this was a clear-cut 100% victory in a way, and our members were sort of pleased to have it come out like this. But the original article, this shows what we're up against in the so-called free world. The original article in Newsweek had been reprinted in France and distributed by hundreds of thousands of copies, because this was a terrific blow to the prestige of the French army right in France and the rest of Western Europe. What they were trying to do was to break down the prestige of the French army. Newsweek sent us this categorical confession that they were wrong and we were right, but they refused to publish it in Newsweek. They refused to publish any correction. Now, you never could have caught up completely to the original damage anyway. You never can in a case like that. But if they had published the retraction and confession, then Jacques Soustelle could have had that printed and had reprints made and distributed 100 or 200,000 copies of that to have helped some to offset the damage that had been done. But they wouldn't do that. So the victory didn't do as much as it should have. But at least it was an interesting experience, and it shows what letter writing can do when directed at a certain specific target with bullets that hit it. You can be sure that Time magazine knew about this, and so did U.S. News and World Report, as all the people in Newsweek, and it undoubtedly made them somewhat or a little more careful for a while about something that was categorically false, as this had been. Now, a third experience with letter writing is in connection with writing members of Congress. In connection with the firing of General Walker and the muzzling of the military, you will remember that Senator Thurman wanted to have an investigation, and he was trying to get the Senate Armed Services Committee to appoint a subcommittee to do this investigating, and he wasn't getting anywhere. And we got word on a Friday, almost noon, that the vote was coming up the following Wednesday or Thursday in the Senate Armed Services Committee, and they were going to vote against doing anything overwhelmingly. Well, there wasn't time to reach our members. We can't anyway afford to send out a bulletin, a memo special to our members. The cost is just too great. The once-a-month bulletin is all we can do. And there wasn't time anyway to do any print job. We have an incredibly good printer, but he's up 28 miles away in Lowell, and this had to be too fast. So what we planned to do was to get in touch through our chapter leaders with whatever members we could. So I immediately wrote the one-page message, and we put girls to cutting stencils to run it through our duplicator, a little ordinary one of these purple ink duplicators in the office, 300 copies per stencil. And we got others to get the envelopes ready. We now have, so we could run through between 4,000 and 5,000 chapter leaders named just like this on an automatic machine that does 6,000 an hour from our stencil. But we didn't have that set up then. We had to pick the chapter leaders out and get the envelopes ready. So we put some people on that. And we got into the mail before the post office closed that afternoon, an airmail letter to all of our chapter leaders, all of the United States, except right there where an overnight mail would carry it. But these still didn't reach them until Monday morning. And most of our chapter leaders either have businesses or have professional offices, or they have jobs, and they don't get their Monday morning mail till Monday night. So we didn't start reaching our people until Monday night, and this vote was coming up either Wednesday or Thursday. But our members got busy on it, our chapter leaders did, I'll give you an illustration I can tell you about because she got up herself in a group like this and told it. Among our very good chapter leaders in Los Angeles is Josephine Wood. And some of you, one or two of you here, may know Joe and Jim Wood. He was senior vice president of Texaco. He's a very high official in the Texaco company. And they have a very beautiful home out there in Pasadena. And his wife, Jo, is one of our chapter leaders for a long time. And they'd been on a vacation, a short one, and got back Monday night, about, as I remembered, about 11 o'clock. And they came into the house and looked at all the mail that had piled up, and here was a letter from us, from the John Birch Society. And so she opened it up, and here was this memorandum about this, and she said, well, I guess this can wait till tomorrow morning anyway. And she passed it over to Jim, and he looked at it, and he said, no, I don't think it can. I think Mr. Welch is asking you to go to work on it right now. So she said, all right. She told us, she said, before even the bags had gone upstairs, that we'd unpacked or anything, said, I got busy trying to get our members by telephone. And she said at 1:30 in the morning, I figured that's late enough to be trying to call them. I called all I could, and I had to explain the story to each one and ask them to write a letter or send a telegram. We'd ask them to send letters or telegrams to the chairman, who was Senator Russell of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and to 2 or 3 other senators and their own senators, as many as they wanted, and also to the White House if they wanted to, and anybody else they wanted, but especially to Senator Russell, 1 or 2 more, and if they were writing, or if not with telegrams, send a written copy of the telegram to Senator Thurman, so he'd have the ammunition. So she had to explain all of this and tell them about it, and at 1:30, why, she decided that was late enough, and that she would send her own. So she wrote out her own telegram and got it ready to send to Senator Russell and a few more, and she picked the phone up and started to give the address of the telegram, and the Western Union operator said, yes, ma'am, we know all about it. We'll get to you in about an hour. They were absolutely flooded with people for the same kind of thing had happened in getting them out. So, as far as we could tell, they got 20,000 telegrams and letters into Washington by Wednesday morning, which is pretty good on that short notice. And when the vote came, some of you may remember, the vote was overwhelmingly for the investigation. And there's much more to the story than that, because even after they had voted for the investigation, the pressures against it were terrific, all down the line. McNamara and the White House and everybody else. McNamara particularly. Then Russell refused to appoint a new committee. He took the Senate Armed Services Preparedness Committee, of which Stennis of Mississippi was the chairman, and assigned this investigation to that subcommittee, appointing Senator Thurman to it as an extra member. He had to let Thurman in on this because it's Thurman's idea. So Stennis' subcommittee, Senate Armed Services Preparedness Committee, was given the job of this investigation of the muzzling of the military, the censorship of their speeches, and the firing of General Walker. But they had no money. No money for counsel, no money for investigations, or nothing. And Thurman couldn't get any money. And Stennis apparently wasn't helping him too much to get money, and Russell wouldn't turn loose any money. And finally, there was enough argument that Senator Russell agreed to allocate $30,000 to this subcommittee, and the minute the subcommittee got it, they paid it to some university that they owed approximately $30,000 to for some research job that had been done for this subcommittee. And they told Senator Thurman, no, you can't. This money has been allocated to the subcommittee. It's true, but we owe this job for research, and we paid them with it, and you can't have it. And it looked like for a while there, for a few days, that somebody was going to have to go out and raise about $75,000 from private citizens in the United States to enable an official subcommittee of the United States Senate to do the job it had been told to do. And that's how bad it was. But in the meantime, the weekend was coming up when our bulletin was due to go out. So now we could tell the whole story. And in the bulletin, we told the whole story. We had room. This was going to all of our members. We asked them whether or not they had got the news before and had sent a telegram or a letter. Now, to write or wire the Armed Services committee, the chairman Russell, any of the other members, we published a list of all the members and also all the members of this subcommittee headed by Stennis, to write all of them, as many of them as they could, whether they had before or not, and make the whole point of their letters that this investigation had been voted and that they, as good American citizens, didn't want to see a whitewash or a going through motions kind of thing, but a real, honest-to-goodness investigation. The information, again, the best we could get was that our people poured about 150,000 letters in there within a few days. And so the committee did get the money and did go ahead with the investigation. How much we had to do with that part of it, we don't know. We can tell you this because Senator Thurman himself made the statement in public. There's a man sitting right here, heard him make it, that without the John Birch Society, he could not have had his investigation. And so when Thurman himself said it, we can say it too. How much we had to do with helping to get the money, there's no way to know, we don't know. But they did have the investigation, and although it was hamstrung and stymied and everything in the world done to it, they published 7 reports of the hearings, and then the final report of the committee, making the 8th volume. Even then, they published only 3,000 each of some of these reports of the hearings, and they'd run out at once by those that were on order to the libraries, and you couldn't get them. Our members couldn't get them. We got back into the act then to insist that they had to publish enough copies so at least they'd be available to the serious people that wanted them for reference, and they did reprint or republish some more. But finally, the 8th volume was the actual report of the committee, about 150 pages, of which 50 pages was a bunch of junk, and 100 pages was Thurman's minority report. And his minority report, constituting 2/3 of the whole report, was pretty good. And enough of our members got it, so it's been source material for things that they have wanted to do, and a lot of other people besides. The hearings could have been far more conclusive, far more effective, except for the pressures that were put on. You'd have to dig into them yourself to see the kind of pressures McNamara used and put on to keep from anything from being done or from coming out that was important. He wasn't quite successful. But I'm really bringing it up as an illustration of what can be done with letter writing when it's aimed at a specific target, and a case in which we were quite successful. There have been others in which we were not. Now, maybe that's enough about letter writing. I could give you a few more, and actually out of 200 or more campaigns, there have been a lot of them to talk about, but that is enough on that. What we are doing is listing the kinds of efforts in which we began to be engaged and have been engaged since the society started. A different category was the formation of fronts, ad hoc committees. The communists have a very peculiar quirk. The worst thing they could ever possibly think of to say about you is that you are just like the communists. Now, with most of us, if we said somebody was just like ourselves, we'd think that we were giving them a compliment. But the communists, whenever they can, try to accuse the John Birch Society of being just like the communists. That's the worst thing they can possibly say. So they've done all they could to make capital out of the fact that right in the Blue Book, right in the original meeting, continuously since, we have urged the formation of fronts on our members. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's not a thing in the world wrong with a front. It's a good old American custom. It's a rather slang word to get away from using the Latin, but it's a front's an ad hoc committee. It's a group, a committee, a formation, an organization in which you get, say, 100 people to work with each other for some specific objective that they agree on. 100 people who probably don't agree with each other about anything else on earth. You don't care. But that one thing. And it's a grand old American custom. It's been very useful and very effective. What's wrong with the communist fronts that gives them such a smell is the purposes for which they are organized and the methods they use, not with the idea of a front itself. Now, we've urged fronts from the beginning, have used them. We've had a lot of big ones and little ones, some national ones, a lot more regional. We, at one time, the society didn't directly run them. They were separate ad hoc committees set up. There were 349 committees in this country working on slave labor goods. And they had a lot of impact on reducing, at least, the amount of goods coming in here from Poland and other slave labor countries onto the shelves of American retailers. Right now, there are probably 200 local committees to support your local police in that many areas of the country, and there are more being formed all the time. Some statewide, some countywide, some citywide. And of course it's extremely important because breaking down the local police is a long-range, extremely important objective of the communists. That's why every dope you see who doesn't know anything about what it's all about but gets arrested in a riot, the first thing he says is police brutality. Maybe the police did nothing but kiss him, for goodness sakes, but he immediately starts shouting police brutality. He's been trained to. The first thing Oswald shouted was police brutality. That's part of a long-range communist plan. And we've been trying to wake up the American people to the fact that these police brutality charges were part of straight, direct communist propaganda. And the drive for police review boards is a very important part of communist propaganda. These police review boards will take a policeman who, in the middle of the extreme stress of trying to arrest some real criminal who's very active, maybe in actual murder, and if he does one single thing under the pressure that could possibly be construed as unjustified, they bring him up 6 weeks or 2 months later before some police review board and claim that he didn't use proper judgment and his pay ought to be docked, or he ought to be fired, or he ought to be suspended, or so forth. And of course they don't even have to have any justification. They pretend it or manufacture it in many cases, or the witnesses who are bringing these charges against the police will. The whole idea is to get the local police so frightened that they don't dare use the proper authority to put down the rioters. The communists are working to where the rioters can run riot and the police don't dare do anything about it. They do it through these charges of police brutality and through these police review boards. And we've gone to work on it, been working quite hard on it for 2 or 3 years to wake up the American people, and we are having a lot of impact. As I say, we probably have 200 committees working on it. Support your local police committees, and some of them are manned by very important people in their local communities who are not members of the society. In almost all cases, these committees were formed by members of the society and are pretty well guided and run by them. But there again, you take 3 or 4 members of the society can get 100 good citizens to help them. And they have been very effective and very helpful. There's a long ways to go yet to get enough of the American people to realize that support your local police is based on some very sound knowledge of communist plans and purposes and has a very positive purpose of its own, and is not just, as you find some people say, well, who isn't for mother and God? Well, that is not the case at all. This is a very crucial part, a very important part of the communist plan for taking over America that is involved here. And of course what they want is to get the local police so discredited, so demoralized, so disparaged in every way that they have the excuse to send in central government troops. And of course, some of the sending of troops across state lines has been specifically to set the precedent. And the invasion of Mississippi and at Oxford, of course, was a horrible use of federal marshals, exactly the way de Gaulle has been using his barboos. And they were the same kind as de Gaulle's barboos, a bunch of hoodlums given temporary authority by a central government. And they want to have these kind of people replace the local police everywhere. You come up against another point. I hadn't intended to talk so much about the local police situation right here, but maybe as good a time as any. I got into it. You come up against the fact, and as why it's such a part of communist planning, that as they get further into the police state enforcement, they cannot count on the local police to enforce these incredibly harsh and illegal orders against their neighbors. They won't do it. But some bunch of central hoodlums that have been deputized as federal marshals just for that job can be sent, if there's 1,000 of them, 1 week into one place and next week somewhere else and next week somewhere else, and they don't have any restraints or reasons to hold back at all. They don't know the people. It's very important to the communists to do everything they can to make it seem plausible to supplant the local police, take their authority away, and use federal marshals and federal police instead. Now, going back to the committees, a lot of success in waking people up. A lot of these committees formed, but we've got to have a lot more, and they're being organized all of the time. Now, we've just begun to organize the TAC committees, and that's the truth about civil turmoil, in which we want to bring out what the real reasons and purposes are behind all of this turmoil. Complete communist planning, communist instigation, communist control, everything about it, but the American people don't know it, and we need help. We haven't got enough members to do this education job except by educating the educators. And by this I mean ordinary citizens who can be brought to understand and tell their neighbors and friends. So we're setting up these TAC committees. They will have names like Pasadena, that's capital P and the rest small letters. TACT is all T-A-C-T, all in caps, and then committee, capital C in small letters. Pasadena TACT Committee. The word TACT in capitals in the middle every time. And the TACT stands for Truth About Civil Turmoil. The members are taking to it very well. What we're after is to create understanding. And the purpose of the TACT committees is to get out more literature. Instead of 15 John Birches that are in there, they can get 100. So you got 85 neighbors, and get them all to work, and you have 100 people distributing Alan Stang's book. It's very simple. And the pamphlet, Two Revolutions at Once, and some of the other material that we've been talking about, of which we have a lot of good material now published, very convincing material, to that many more thousands of people. And the TAC committees can become very important in this crucial fight we're in now, the one on which we are concentrating, which is the exposure of the communist hands in the civil rights movement. I imagine there's about 15 of the TAC committees already formed before we're even ready for them, and I think we may get as many as 500 TAC committees within the next few months, with very able, good citizens and good people in them. They'll have a very powerful influence because they will distribute literally millions of copies of a book like Alan Stang's if we get, say, 500 good committees. So there's nothing wrong with fronts. There's all kinds of others. There's a lot of local ad hoc committees formed by our members for local purposes. My guess would be that we have today between 2,000 and 4,000 fronts, if you want to call them that, scattered all over the United States, all working for good causes and handled by good people. We do our best to see that they do not get off on some of the wrong roads. Sometimes it has to be watched pretty carefully, and there are times when we don't have the responsibility, can't do anything about it, don't try, and just make it clear that somebody's picked up some idea of ours or some item on our agenda or some purpose we're supporting, and some other group has picked it up and gone ahead with it. We can't help that. We can only be responsible to the extent that we are responsible for what our own members do, and even then the responsibility is limited as to where the law of agency applies. This is all in connection with fronts. They are still ad hoc committees, are very good things if they're working for a good purpose and use good methods. And we certainly shall try to see that both is true with regard to any fronts we have anything to do with. The formation of fronts, we also work on petitions in some cases. We have petitions circulating for the impeachment of Warren, and there are a large number of impeach Warren committees around the country. We have to put up these billboards, impeach Warren, distribute our impeach Warren packet, which sells for $1 and has a lot of material on why Warren should be impeached and on the breakdown of the Constitution by the Supreme Court under Warren's leadership and so forth. So that's just another list of the fronts that I should have mentioned. Number 6 in this list of efforts and kinds of efforts, as originally planned, was to be the publication of exposure articles, exposing individual communists or pro-communists, near-communists or communist sympathizers for their pro-communist activities, and especially those who were not generally recognized as being pro-communist. Well, we haven't done much about it, mainly because we haven't had a medium. We said in the beginning we had to have American opinion with a circulation of about 200,000. It'd have to go through our own magazine because you cannot get mixed up with other people's editorial and financial problems for this kind of operation. We haven't had the medium. We've been too busy. So the nearest we've come to it is 2 articles that we published. One was on Cyrus Eden, about 6,000 words, written by a professor up in Canada, and apparently nobody else would publish. As far as I can gather, it was sent to every magazine in the United States that could be considered on the conservative side, from some little small sheet to the American Legion's paper that monthly. It comes out of Indianapolis, which is a pretty good paper and always used to have, maybe still does, 1 article a month on anti-communism. Anyway, we published it, and we couldn't see any reason why the others didn't. We didn't change a thing in it except to straighten out some of the English to try to bring it up to our literary standards, which are quite high. We always have kept the magazine very high standard from that point of view. We published it, and I think it did some good. We just pointed right out that Cyrus Eaton, whatever his background or official affiliations were, was certainly everything he was doing was to help the communists, was working the communists, and no question about it. And that was in the pugwash conferences or the hogwash conferences or whatever you want to call them. The second one of these two we published probably has been more valuable and more effect. This is with regard to Harry Overstreet's book, What We Must Know About Communism. It was played up as a terrific anti-communist book. It was one of only two books in the 8 years of the Eisenhower administration which was given the full prestige of the presidency of the United States behind it to help to promote it. You may remember that the way they did it was that they had the book on Dulles' bedside table in the hospital when President Eisenhower called on Dulles to visit him in the hospital. And Dulles told the president what a wonderful book it was and that he ought to read it. And the president said he'd be glad to and took it with him under his arm. And it was the kind of book with the jacket you could make out from big type what the book was from the jacket. He took it out under his arm and went out and got in his limousine and had it held up so the photographers could get a picture of the president in the back seat of his limousine with this book, What We Must Know About Communism, by Harry Overstreet there. They gave it a terrific push. And of course, it's about as anti-communist as some of Frederick Schumann's lectures, where the first 45 minutes is beautiful, straightforward stuff, and then the last 5 to 10 minutes is the exact communist line at that particular time. Don't forget that always varies. What was the communist line 5 years ago may not be all today, or vice versa. There's some beautiful illustrations I could give you of something which 10 years ago would have been wonderful anti-communism, and they think the American people still think it is, which today fits exactly into the pro-communist line because it's what they want to put over right now. The Ugly American, the book, was a perfect sample. That book 5 years before would have been a wonderful piece of anti-communism. When it came out, it was one of the best pieces of pro-communism that ever been published because of how it fit into the timing at that time. Well, anyway, Overstreet's book, 3/4 of it gets your confidence, seems to be good anti-communism, and 1/4 of it, of course, is selling the exact ideas the communists wanted sold at that time. It's anything but an anti-communist book. We published an article as soon as this happened, and all this glorification of this book, What We Must Know About Communism, we had written to order a 6,000-word article. We played it up on the cover of American Opinion, featured it, had reprints made to send out. The title was What We Must Know About Overstreet, and we laid it right on the line. All the fellow's communist connections and so forth and so on. Now, Overstreet claimed that because of the humanitarian aspects of some of these communist front movements, that he had been misled, that he and Bernardo had never known much about communism, been very uninformed about it, uninterested, unaware. And so during the war years and so forth, when it was sort of the fad, and wrong at that time, he, by the humanitarian appeal, had been pulled in, beguiled into letting his name be used on some organizations which later turned out to have communist affiliations or be communist fronts. And he was very sorry, and that he'd gone to the FBI and he'd gone to the House Committee and had clearance, and it was just a sad mistake. Well, we pointed out that quite a number of these fronts that he had joined had already been officially declared subversive and communist fronts before he joined them. We pointed out a few other things, and we made clear that he was not so ignorant of communism as he pretended, and we could point right to some of his other books and show how he was promoting the communist line. We laid it out pretty straight, so much so that, frankly, it had a lot of effect in getting him off the lecture platform. Our members would get reprints of this and give it to the program chairman of groups they were in and keep him from being invited. He was a lot less in evidence for quite a while, for 3 or 4 years. I saw some of the letters that he wrote, some of the professors around the country who themselves were not conservatives but were intellectually honest, would write him and say, what on earth, what can you say about this, what's the story? And he'd write back 3- and 4-page letters, and they were really pitiful. They'd make you feel sorry for the man. They just complete double talk that said nothing. He didn't have any answer. When we published this pamphlet, we said that we didn't know whether Professor Overstreet would try to make anything out of it or not. If he did, it was all right with us. We had more material we weren't publishing. So for 3 or 4 years, we didn't hear anything, and he was pretty much quiet. Then he publishes this book, recent book, about 6 months to a year ago, but he devotes about half, 2/3 of the book to us. Well, wasn't any use trying to answer that, because he's still claiming that, pretending that he didn't even really know anything about communism until about 1940. It's all new to him. He was completely innocent and ignorant. So right after this came out, we published in the Bulletin a letter which we had happened to have all the time in our files by a very strange coincidence that we happened to have it. If you remember, back in 1923, J. Lovestone was the official head of the American Communist Party. He broke with Stalin, supposedly, in about 1929. He claims today to be a Trotskyite, I believe, and still anti-Kremlin. I mean, it's a bunch of nonsense. But anyway, he did supposedly break with the Kremlin, or with Stalin, in 1929. But in 1923, he was the official head in the United States of the American Communist Group over here, and so recognized for years. So we had a letter, actually the original letter, showing the very closest cooperation back in 1923 between Harry Overstreet and J. Lovestone. And we published it after he brought out this other book. I don't know how much this will quiet him down again, but it ought to show our people anyway, all of them, that they shouldn't pay any attention to Mr. Overstreet. Now, we've published a lot of biographies, some of them of left-wingers. Robert Montgomery wrote for us an excellent biographical sketch of Arthur Schlesinger Jr. And we've had some others, and we have more, and we'll have more. Let's make what we are talking about clearer by an illustration. There is the head of one. This was true when I put these together 7 years ago. There was then the head of one of the great educational institutions in the East, not Harvard, incidentally, whom at least some of us believed to be a communist. But I said that even with $100,000 to hire sleuths to keep him and his then current contacts under constant surveillance for a while, and to retrace every step of his past history, I doubted if it could be proved on him. But with few $1,000s to pay for the proper amount of careful research, which could be an entirely logical expenditure and undertaking of a magazine like American Opinion, I did believe we could get all the material needed for quite a shock. I said, of course, we would have to satisfy ourselves completely as to whether our guess had been correct from the preliminary research before going ahead with the project or spending any such money, and of course, completely so before ever publishing any article. We're not publishing any article that's disparaging anybody in any way unless we are absolutely certain of our facts and the justice of the article. I pointed out that now such an article might still be pretty much ignored by the general press, and of course we would be smeared by the liberals in every way they could contrive, for next to a woman scorned, hell hath no fury like that of a liberal, about whom or whose heroes somebody has told the truth. But the smearing we would have to expect in due course anyway, no matter what we did, and the article, even if by delayed action, would have a powerful impact. A lot of the very people who joined in the smears would begin to wonder. Some of them would go back and read the article a second time. Others, never having read it, but hearing about it, would get a copy and do so. The softening process of wonder and doubt at work on the resistant minds of these liberals and on the simply uninformed minds of some of the general public would be getting those minds in condition for another shock and then for the next one to penetrate further. What would make this particular initial sample shock that I had in mind such a bombshell was first the extreme importance of this man in other fields besides education, and second that almost nobody, except some of those on the same side with him, of course, suspected him. It had been only a very minor but a very strange incident that happened to turn my surprised eyes a few years before that to watching what he said and did, and watching it against this possibility that he might be one of the boys. But once you did just that long enough, there was less and less room left for doubt about his real purposes and accomplishments. Yet this man had on his board and administrative committees some of the ablest and most patriotic of Americans. Even a suggestion that he was a communist, if that suggestion had been backed up by enough details and facts to make it obviously worthy of consideration by any fair-minded man, would have come as an absolute blockbuster in a lot of circles besides the world of education. Now, I'm giving you this for a purpose because it leads up to something that I think is important, and I didn't want to come at it without some background to make clearer what I was saying. Now, incidentally, as I indicated just now in passing, one of the hardest things for the ordinary, decent American to realize is that a secret communist looks and acts just like anybody else, only more so. Or that anybody he, the ordinary, decent American, happens to know personally could possibly be a communist. You'll have people say to you, oh, he can't be a communist. I know him personally. And they mean it. I have known the man that I was talking about back there, this man under discussion, for years. And he was and still is, for all outside purposes, one of the nicest guys you ever met. Most of them are. Now, as to the number of deserving and sufficiently important targets for the arrows of any such series of articles, ladies and gentlemen, there was no reason to worry. That problem wouldn't give any of us a second thought. Highly placed secret communists, or at least workers for the communist cause, is something with which we are absolutely loaded. And while proving that any one of them is or ever has been an actual communist might be too difficult or even impossible, proving that the same man is a worker for the communist cause is a matter of the painstaking accumulation of a tremendous number of details, and then of selecting, merging, and compressing until you have the proper amount of material that yields the greatest explosive power per page. Now, that was background, as I say, to the fact there's another important reason why we would have loved to embark on these exposures, besides those that might first occur to you, and I have wanted to bring that out, which I'm now going to do, and let's creep up on it by analogy for a clearer view. I think this might possibly help to explain some of the impossibilities to you, some things that seem utterly incredible. You can't see how and why they would happen, and this is a partial explanation of some of them. At the time of Pearl Harbor, and in the early years thereafter, it would have been absolutely fatal to Franklin D. Roosevelt and George Catlett Marshall for the part they had played in bringing on that catastrophe to have become known to the American people. By coercion on the one hand and rewards on the other, Roosevelt contrived to have perjury, postponements, decisions against the evidence, and every necessary means used before or in connection with one hearing after another to keep the truth from getting into the record. He refused to allow the court-martials demanded by General Short and Admiral Kimmel, to which they were clearly entitled, and he wrecked other service careers brutally and without hesitation. He did all of this to keep the facts covered up. For the real facts not only constituted plain, unadulterated treason on the part of both Marshall and Roosevelt, but they would unquestionably have been so regarded at that time by a horrified American public. Exposure at that time, in the spring of 1942 or any time during 1942, might have brought Roosevelt's impeachment despite the war, and it would certainly have been disastrous to the reputations and future careers of both Marshall and himself. But now notice that less than 10 years later, through publication of the books by Morgenstern, Kimmel, Admiral Theobald, and others, the true facts concerning Pearl Harbor were definitely established and made available for anybody who wanted to read them. And by this time, in just 10 years, so far had effective public opinion in America been gradually eased towards the internationalist left, the Roosevelt worshippers did not challenge the facts at all. They took the position instead, and somebody mentioned Ernest Lindley. He was one of the men that did. He was a very favorable biographer of Roosevelt, eulogized him. And Lindley, among others, took the position instead of practically admitting the facts about Pearl Harbor and of openly praising Roosevelt for having been so far-sighted and such a courageous statesman as to have used this means of getting a united America wholeheartedly into the war. A war which was then prosecuted to such a glorious success on behalf of the future happiness of the world under a one-world socialist, meaning communist in a way, under a one-world socialist government which had been brought about or was being brought about and which would bring peace to all mankind. In other words, the sacrifice had been a wonderful, worthwhile piece of statesmanship. Now already, and this was 7 years ago, it was true then, it's even more true today, already through their stooges like Milo Vangelis, who was supposed to be in disgrace in Yugoslavia, and Boris Pasternak, who was supposed to be suffering bitter enmity of the dictators in Russia. And when he died, you know, he was living in quite a nice estate with several servants inside the Soviet. You can imagine how much he was in disgrace with the masters of the Kremlin. Pasternak, who is supposed to be suffering bitter enmity of the dictators in Russia, but whose books have thus been publicized because of this supposed enmity, and please note, whose books have been helped by the left wing to become bestsellers in America, and the whole left wing glorified Pasternak's book, Dr. Zhivago. Already through such books, which gullible Americans more readily swallow as true because of the supposed hatred of the authors for their respective governments, tens of thousands of opinion-molding Americans have been more and more accepting or finding less unbelievable the thesis of these books that communism itself is all right, in fact is a glorious system, and that all that's wrong with it is the character of the people now running the system. Already, in hundreds of other ways, the communists have been rubbing out or making more and more shadowy the lines of disagreement and the once sharp differences between our ways and theirs. The movement has been and is smooth, widespread, continuous, insidious, and powerful. Already, remember, I wrote this, and frankly, I'm rather proud of it. I wrote this 7 years ago. Already, communism and communists, even with a record like Oppenheimer's, become more and more respectable in this country. And outspoken or firmly uncompromising anti-communists become more and more disparaged as fanatics. And you've just seen Oppenheimer given $50,000 of your money and mine to glorify him. And if you don't realize that anti-communists are being maneuvered into considered as fanatics, you certainly will pretty soon. And so, even 7 years ago, it was becoming less and less reprehensible for an American to be working for communism, especially if he labeled it international socialism, even though he committed treason to the United States in doing so. The top American secret communists in this country, therefore, have fully expected, and those today even more so than 7 years ago, do fully expect that by the time it is ever possible for anybody to bring out the fact that they have been working as secret communists, instead of that action then being considered as having been reprehensible, they will be praised for having in courageous, far-sighted, and statesmanlike manner helped to speed progress and the wave of the future, just as Roosevelt was praised 10 years later for what he had done, which was a crime of high treason when he did it. These men believe that instead of having committed treason to the United States, they will be shown to have and be regarded as having been carrying out a deeper and superior loyalty to an all-encompassing one-world ideal which included the United States. They know that the moral judgments of the future belong to the victors, and they are confident that the agreed-upon legend, which becomes history, will be written by themselves and their supporters. They are well aware of the thought which Sir John Harington expressed, "For if it prosper, none dare call it treason," which of course is where John Stormer got the title for his book, was from our Blue Book with that reference in it. Increasingly, as we near that stage, therefore, exposure of secret American communists will mean less and less. Or those with such strong communist sympathies that can now be appointed to the very highest jobs in our government And still nobody even raises an eyebrow about it. What can you do if you do? It's being accepted more and more. Again, we see why the destruction of Senator McCarthy took precedence over everything else on the communist American agenda. For McCarthy was exposing treason while it was still treason, and when it really hurt their cause. Whereas they knew that if they could only hold off such exposure for a few more years, bringing out the same facts and exposing the same men would not amount to anything serious anyway. If the exposure and trial of Alger Hiss should happen today, there wouldn't be anything to it. You couldn't get anywhere. It's all being accepted. And this brings us back to the step that we were supposed to be discussing of our own exposure through publication of present secret communists, while it would still shock the American people and could have some real effectiveness. It would have a lot 5 or 6 years ago. It certainly would to some extent at the present time. But we haven't been able to do as much of it as I wished we could. I did want, however, to bring out this explanation of why some men quite high in our government can possibly try to justify to themselves what they are doing. And this is certainly a part of the explanation. Now, one thing we originally planned to do, but have never got around even to trying, was to run hypocritical characters like Gordon Hall off the lecture platforms. But this takes knowledge, understanding, and technical know-how that we simply have never had time to impart to our members. Can be done by perfectly proper means. A friend of mine and a friend of Larry's here, we were helping, the two of us ran one famous Chinese off the lecture platform pretty conclusively, and he's been off of it ever since, despite the millions of dollars that he has that he brought from Asia with him. But you do have to know what you're doing and go at it properly. Let's skip it and go to the positive side of the same coin, which is our American Opinion Speakers Bureau. We did plan originally to set up a Speakers Bureau. We have done so, and it's becoming more effective now all the time. We have, I think about 60 speakers on the list for whom we are setting up speeches, some 15 or 20 for whom we are setting up tours practically all the time. The Bureau is doing a better job all the time. It's becoming a more important part of our total educational program. We still haven't got quite as far as we'd like in one of the major purposes of the Speakers Bureau. And that's to offset the liberal free speakers. That's an interesting bit of language, isn't it? Liberal and free both mean theoretically the same thing, yet they both have quite a different meaning there. There are in this country, even if you count the Rotary and Kiwanis and Lions and Exchange clubs and the others, all the service clubs, as one group, one classification. You take the service clubs, the PTAs, the men's Bible classes in the Protestant churches, the Holy Name Society in the Catholic Church, the old men's clubs, the boards of trade, the small chambers of commerce, the women's Republican clubs, the women's clubs. There are over 20 categories in this country of groups that meet either weekly or monthly, either for luncheon or for dinner or at 8 o'clock at night. And there are over 10,000 of those meeting every day, every 24 hours. Very few of them patronize the speakers' bureaus, the lecture agencies at all, because the national speakers' bureaus don't want that business. They just can't possibly afford the circularization and the direct correspondence that is required for the sake of the fee of $50 to $75 that's involved. And these groups themselves don't want to patronize the Speakers Bureau, because instead of paying even the $50 or $75, they can get speakers for nothing. And they'd rather have them for nothing, which leaves it wide open to the left. And have they taken advantage of it? And I can assure you that in every 24 hours of the morning, now some of these people don't speak on communism or socialism at all, and they are very presentable what they say, but there's a slant, there's a twist, and then it varies all the way from that to the guy that's selling outright communism, straightforward. It's all the way in between. And I can assure you that within every 24 hours, there's 10,000 of those batches of poison being poured into the American mind through these media. Now, we have set out to do something about it. We're making some headway. We eventually are going to have all over the United States lists of local volunteers who can speak not on socialism or communism, we don't want it, speak on some subjects that they know, but at least we'll be speaking from an Americanist point of view. So far as he is in his slant, it'll be from the conservative side, and we'll be therefore offsetting this other effect. Eighth, we would go into undertakings on the international front, and that for many reasons we would start expanding our body into other countries as soon as there were enough energy and resources which could properly be spared for that purpose. And please note, ladies and gentlemen, that I said body at that point on purpose, not organization. There is a huge difference, as I hope to make clear later in this meeting. An organization is a collection of individuals and or groups held together more or less loosely and more or less temporarily by a common interest or a common objective. A body, in the sense I'm using it, because it is the closest I can find to a word to express my concept, is an organic entity. The Americans for Democratic Action is an organization. The Catholic Church is a body, or at least it used to be. The Republican Party is an organization. The Communist Party is a body which can move and work and make itself effective as an entity. And that's the point. Any group is a body, means what can it move as an entity. Now we'll return to this whole thought and its importance later. Let's leave it now that we had hoped to have our body grow across national boundaries as soon as we properly could. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it hasn't worked out that way, and we haven't been able to do it. There's just so much to do. There's a tremendous demand for all of the resources in both money, personnel, executive know-how that we can get hold of. It's so important to keep doing the very best job we can in this country that we have made no attempt to go across international lines, and in the last 2 or 3 years have had to resist, strongly resist, temptations and demands that we do so. We had right in Los Angeles 10 days ago a delegation from Western Canada. They spent hours and hours with our people. Out of about 24 hours, they must have spent 3 or 4 of it just looking at our films about ourselves. How much they spend with you, John? Much at all?
Just an hour.
An hour with you. Who were trying to get us to form a branch in Western Canada. Let them, Western Canadians, run it. They were good people. They were understand the picture, and they needed it. But we can't do it. We told them what we've told other groups. You take our material, everything explains our structure, what we're doing. You go ahead and use it, form something as near like the society as you want to, use our methods if it will help, benefit all you can from our experience. We'll send you new material. You can buy everything we got, and in the beginning, if we have to, we'll give you everything, 1 copy of everything we've got, which is quite extensive, and do the best you can. If and after we have licked the communist, when we have finished that job and are ready to go ahead with our long-range educational purposes and program, then we will get in touch with you and see if we can iron out any differences which have arisen and see if we can clear the decks to incorporate you into the John Birch Society as a part of the total organization. But until then, do it on your own. We've had efforts, temptations is another word, inducements, pleadings to start chapters in Venezuela, in West Germany, in the Dominican Republic before it was too late, in England, in South Africa, in Japan. Quite a group in Japan, terribly anxious to have us form a branch of the society in Japan. We just haven't dared, just because of lack of resources and time. Some of the people from Cuba are quite interesting. We have people from Cuba. Of course, you always got to be careful because you don't know how many of them are real anti-communists and how many of them aren't. But some of them you know are good, and we have ways of checking pretty carefully where we know the people we're checking with are anti-communists, and some of them are pretty well informed. But we have people come from Cuban refugees, they got all kinds of ideas. They want us to help, sometimes to raise money to do this, something to do else, to do something about Cuba. We tell them all right off the beginning, look, you're wasting your time. No matter how much we sympathize with you and how much we wish you well, our job is right here in this country, because remember this, Cuba was not lost in Havana. Cuba was lost in Washington. And the only place Cuba will ever be saved is not in Havana, but in Washington. If somebody could raise $20 million for you people and buy you all the planes and bombs you wanted, and you got the people organized and your troops organized, and you went to Cuba and you bombed out Castro and you drove him off the island, and you captured and arrested all the communists and put them in jail and set up an anti-communist regime, it wouldn't last 3 months, as long as the communists controlled Washington and London and Paris and the United Nations. It wouldn't last even if they didn't control the others, as long as they controlled Washington. They'd find some way to overthrow you and bring back some successor to Castro. It's ridiculous. It's futile. The place that Cuba has to be brought back to freedom is in Washington, not in Havana. And we are so sure of that and so convinced that we are not willing to dissipate our energy and resources by trying to go off on any of these tangents, even if we would anyway. Of course, we wouldn't dare get into any kind of paramilitary action. But, I mean, we don't even believe that we should have any educational drive aimed specifically at the overthrow of Castro or anybody like him. Our job is to educate, inform, create understanding among the American people about what's happening in Washington. Because if we can do that well enough, that will win the battle for us. Whenever it wins it for us, it wins it for the whole world, ultimately. So we have done nothing about this having our body cross international lines. Now, number 10, which was the last one on the list, the last of the original categories of effort, I'll come to in a minute. But before I do, I want to bring up several things we are doing which were not specifically named. Everything we're doing is pretty much in line with the plans that were laid out 7 years ago. We are more and more, because of the book publishers being so closed to conservative writers, it's not quite as bad. It's come back now to where it's not just Regnery, Caxton, and Devon Adair. There are some others that are more and more that will publish some conservative books. And of course, if it's by some big name like J. Edgar Hoover, why, most of the publishers would fight to get it. But the situation has improved. But maybe it's improved partly because of a lot of the things we've done in creating wider sales for anti-communist books, making it more profitable from a straight point of view of economics for these publishers to do it, and possibly because of some of our own publishing that is waking people up. We are getting quite heavily now into the book publishing field as fast as we can find the capital to do it. One of our books, most of you know, was written to order for us by Ed Griffin, The Fearful Master, a second look at the United Nations. And we have now sold, first in the $5, was it exactly 5? I've forgotten, Roger, but right around $5 in the hardbound. And then in the $2 edition, which we have to do what we can afford to do, what we can. And now in the dollar edition, we've sold about 135,000 copies, which is pretty good, and we are very soon going to have to buy another 100,000 in the dollar edition. Well, I should go back and tell you about the Kindles. When we couldn't possibly do the ordinary pocketbook format, because you had to print about 300,000 or 400,000 copies originally to get books in that format out at the price that was competitive. They got it down. The last few years it's been coming down. Today you can do 100,000 on what's known as perfect binding, which is a technical name, so many of you know, for a kind of binding machine. But before that, we couldn't do it. We found a way to bring out paper-bound books like Arthur Bliss Lane's I Saw Poland Betrayed in paper-bound that could sell for $1 without having to print but 25,000 copies. We brought out about 30 or 40 now in this format to sell for $1. And they're not nearly as cheap as when you get into the pocketbook size. These books have cost us 20 to 30 cents a piece for printing, which is pretty close when you got to sell them for $1. But we have been able to do it. We put 12 of them together, as most of you know. I'm explaining this for a comparatively small part of the audience that might not know. We put 12 of them together and called them 1 Dozen Candles. And that goes back to the old adage, Chinese adage, it's better to light one candle than to curse the darkness, which has been made famous in our time by Father Keller of the Christophers using it so much. We put those together as 12 candles in a package to sell for $10, although they're $1 a piece for the books, and we have sold, I don't know, in the 3.5 to 4 years it's been out, we've probably sold 50,000 sets. We are now moving into the professional class in this field. We're going to have 100 books in the Americanist Library series, we hope, within the next 18 months. And of course, there's a lot of investment there, and there's a lot of work to be done. We do have now 2 full-time book editors, and with the staff around them, but that's not nearly enough for what we're putting through. And there are limitations as to help, knowledge, money, capital, everywhere you turn. We still hope to have 100 of them, and just like in the bookstores, we hope to have 1,000 by the end of next year. We have to push fast because we're not like an ordinary business where you wait, you make some money, use it to pay taxes now and make a little more, and then you got a little more capital to wait ahead and you grow slowly and carefully. We can't do it because that's not our purpose. It's not what we're in existence for. We're in existence to get big enough and do a good enough job fast enough to wake up enough of the American people soon enough to what's happening to create the understanding that we'll stop it from happening. And so we push ahead very rapidly, more than it's comfortable to do and more than a businessman like myself likes to do, goodness knows. All right, let's go back to number 10 of the original category of efforts. I said then, finally, and probably most important of all of these courses of action, we shall put our weight into the political scales in this country just as fast and as far as we can. For unless we can eventually and in time reverse by political action the gradual surrender of the United States to communism, the ultimate alternative of reversal by military uprising is fearful to contemplate. I said then, this is 1958, I'm going to read it just as it was then. It's simpler and also, I think, just as clear as any other way I could put it. I said, now there's one thing to which any intelligent, patriotic American might as well make up his mind at once. This is that the thorough and painstaking organization and work at the precinct levels, which wins elections, is not going to be done and can't be done by the Republican Party. Now, please note, I didn't say the Republican Party couldn't win elections, but I said that the work that put them over the top was not going to be done by the party. I said it can be done in one state, under the personal leadership and management of a Barry Goldwater for his own campaign. This, you will note, in the fall in 1958, right after Goldwater had won that senatorial election in Arizona against tremendous odds as far as the registration in the state was concerned. But I said it cannot be done nationally by the present Republican Party, nor by anything that can come out of the present shattered Republican Party in the foreseeable future. And it cannot be accomplished through the leadership, drive, and loyalty-inspiring qualities of any candidate for the presidency, because there simply is not time between the conventions and the elections. In my opinion, not even the Democratic Party, which for all of its bitter internal splits, remains a far more disciplined and unified organization for campaign purposes than the Republican Party, can carry out any such precinct activities precisely directed at a national aim. There are too many local candidates and issues for its precinct leaders and their bosses to think about, which is why the most, and this was very true in 58, more true ever since, which is why the most effective work towards one clearly defined national goal and policy is now being done by Walter Reuther's Cope. And the Democrats are winning elections because Reuther picks so many of their candidates, and those candidates are the beneficiaries of his tremendous organizational reach and resources. We are at a stage, I said then, ladies and gentlemen, it's more true today. Every bit of this, it seems to me, has been proved so by what's happened since. We are at a stage where the only sure political victories are achieved by non-political organization. By organization which has a surer, more positive, and more permanent purpose than the immediate political goals that are only means to an end. by organization which has a backbone and cohesiveness and strength and continuity and definiteness of direction, which are impossible for the old-style political party organization. It is to be noted and is extremely important that the AFL-CIO under Walter Reuther's increasing domination is gradually being converted from an organization to a body in the senses I have distinguished above. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd love to have hours to talk to you on this subject. We've seen so much evidence of it. In the political organization, take any party, it's going this way for a while, then this way, and then this way, depending on the leadership that has been chosen and the leaning towards that. And half the members of the party never know which way they're working or which ones they're for. And those that want to go this way are very unhappy if they happen to go that way, or vice versa. And what's more, every political party falls to pieces after an election, and it takes half the time to the next election to put it back together again. The John Birch Society has certain principles it believes in. They are very closely defined. They are basically solidly conservative. It works towards them by different means, but towards them all the time, stays right on that track. Those that don't believe in the principles don't come with us anyway. Or if they do come and find that they don't agree enough, they drop out, which is all right, and we're still friends. Our course does not waver with the political leadership. It stays right on the track all the time. You know what you're working for. And our people never quit, and the organization never lets down. After any election, and many people in this room have seen it, when the political party is a shambles, the members of the John Birch Society get one good night's sleep, no matter how hard they've been working, and they're right back the next morning at the same job in the same places with the same enthusiasm and the same drive. And it makes a very powerful force in its political impact without it even being political. Now, our members, the John Birch Society never takes any position in politics with regard to any candidate at all, either way. But our members take a very active part in politics, and we want them to. They make their own decisions. We hope that we can give them the information, the knowledge, the understanding, and maybe even the inspiration to make them make very good decisions, very solid decisions, and work very hard at it, but they make up their own minds. We never even tried to guide them with regard to the actual decisions. But in general, when the candidates are pretty clearly defined, they become the most powerful force in any political situation. As the Rockefeller interests certainly found out in California, I don't think there's anything wrong with our saying. We know that it was the work of the Birches right down to the grassroots, distributing literature. Go out, one lady, 700 houses she went to, the old lady twice. One old lady goes 700 houses twice and try to give them a book. Will you read it? Well, no, okay, don't give the book. But if you will read it, yes, I'll give it to you. And that kind of real work. And they become a very powerful factor in any political situation. Let me merely round out the general part of this. I said that we would have to move into this field of having a body carry on continuous, organized educational effort, the same as Cope does, with a body of our own. And what's more, eventually we would have to move ahead of Reuther in strength that could be applied to this purpose and do it as rapidly as possible. I said in '58 that nobody knew, there was no way of finding out how many millions of dollars Reuther had just spent in that election that was just over. Now, how many tens of thousands of precinct workers he had been able to put on the job. But that it was our goal eventually to be able to have enough dedicated workers on our side to more than offset that effort by what our people could do, and that we had to move towards it as rapidly as possible. It was at this point, ladies and gentlemen, that I ended the first day of our original founding meeting in Indianapolis. And at this point I said, fantastic? Of course it's fantastic. But everything I am talking about is fantastic. We are living in fantastic times and a fantastic situation. The alternative to sufficiently fantastic measures and efforts is a fate of fantastic suffering for our children and the equally fantastic loss of a whole humane civilization that has cost countless sacrifices, immeasurable labor, and an infinite number of noble dreams across centuries in the building. We're in circumstances where it is realistic to be fantastic. And it's only realistic if we take fantastic measures. We have tried to bring into these meetings, like this one, as we did at the original founding group, only men and women of sufficient intelligence and imagination to understand that seeming paradox, that in the fantastic circumstances where we find ourselves today, it's only measures which themselves seem fantastic that are realistic with regard to the danger and the problem. Later on, I hope to make the realism of that statement clear, and just as axiomatic, in fact, as a premise for action, as is the present power and force of the evil that is arrayed against us. Let's go now to another whole section of this presentation to take up here the positive side of the question of collectivism. We discussed the disease of collectivism and said we would come back to the answer as to what was to be done about it. So let's take that particular part now and see what basic principle we can establish and what specific objective we can define with regard to the particular battle against collectivism, which would be sure to fit into and be encompassed by our general overall permanent purpose, although that total spiritual aspiration is as yet only foreshadowed. For thus making sharp and clear one part of our philosophy and program, where a concrete area of action is involved, will itself help to build a better understanding of the whole program. And it has seemed to me, ladies and gentlemen, that the whole essence of our purpose and the guiding principle for our action, covering not only our fight against collectivism, but our fight for our constructive replacement, can be summarized in the objective expressed by just 5 words: less government and more responsibility. Now, the principle is simple enough for all to understand. The direction signs leading to the goal expressed are clear enough so that nobody should misjudge them. An honest adherence to that principle and those directions against which to test either candidates or issues will settle in the minds of our followers and ourselves almost all questions which may arise concerning either candidates or issues in the field of political effort. And yet it is broad enough, I believe, to be comprehensive with regard to all that we really desire to attain through political action. Less government and more responsibility. I mean less government of every kind, federal, state, or municipal, and more true responsibility, not only on the part of individuals, but on the part of such reduced governmental units as are necessarily permitted to exist. But of course I mean primarily less federal government, because that is where our greatest danger lies, and more individual responsibility, because that is our greatest need. And now I want to give you some of the arguments and the reasoning by which we must try to inculcate this fundamental principle of less government and more responsibility into the minds of our contemporaries and successors. For we must try to make it a convincing political standard and an accepted goal on the part of not only our own dedicated people, who go all the way with our principles and our ideals, of which this is only a segment. We must try to rally behind this concept thousands or possibly millions of anxious citizens who show a vital interest in their politically determined future, but are yet to be won to a dedication to ideals of more spiritual breadth. So, again, without your leave, I'm going to utilize some extracts from a talk I made a number of years ago at a convocation of the students and faculty of Dickinson College. I do so simply because, having put a lot of work into the preparation of that speech, I can cover the present ground more succinctly and quickly by quoting from it than in any other way. what we must start asking our fellow citizens everywhere to consider as of overwhelming importance to the future of themselves and their families is this: on the basis of all known past human experience, are there any general conclusions with regard to the organization of society which can be set forth with confidence? It seems to me clear that there certainly are. First, government is necessary, some degree of government in any civilized society. There are believers in the possibility and desirability of a governmentless anarchy as a practicable form of human association. But the number of these advocates is comparatively very small. There is no evidence within human historical experience to support their thesis, and there is considerable evidence indicating otherwise. Second, while government is necessary, it is basically a non-productive expense, an overhead cost supported by the productive economy. And like all overhead items, it always has a tendency to expand faster than the productive base which supports it. Third, government is frequently evil. And we do not mean by this that they, governments, are merely dishonest. For all governments, ladies and gentlemen, with very rare exceptions indeed, are thoroughly dishonest. We made the statement in print. It was about 10 years ago now, that there has never in the history of the world been a single government, and this generalization included our current one then and certainly includes our present one now. There's never in the history of the world been a single government that maintained honesty in the handling of a managed, irredeemable currency. A few weeks after we made that statement and put it in print, one of America's ablest and best-known economists, in fact, Walter Spar, who's known to many of you, is the head of the Monetary Committee, the finest group, I believe, of economists in the world in that committee. Walter Spar printed in his little sheet that this is a very broad statement Mr. Welch has made, but I've been studying economics in this field and as a specialist in monetary economics all of my adult life, and to the best of my knowledge, his statement is correct. There has never been a single government that was honest in the handling of a managed, irredeemable currency. But what we are talking about here is something far worse than dishonesty. In December 1956, Professor Sorokin of Harvard, after quoting Lord Acton that great men in the political arena are almost always bad men, went on to reveal the results of his own survey of the criminality of rulers. This survey of the monarchs of various countries and the heads of various republics and democracies and of other governments throughout all history and in all areas, in a selection large enough to constitute a very fair sample, revealed that there was an average of one murderer to every 4 of these rulers. In other words, said Professor Sorokin, the rulers of states are the most criminal groups in their respective populations. With a limitation of their power, their criminality tends to decrease, but it still remains exceptionally high in all nations. Now, an obvious reason for this is the greater temptation to criminality on the part of those who control or influence the police power of a nation, of which these criminals would otherwise stand in more fear. Another reason is that ambitious men with criminal tendencies naturally gravitate into government because of this very prospect of doing or helping to do the policing over themselves. A third reason is that so many apologists can always be found for criminal acts of governments on the grounds that such acts ultimately contribute to the public good and that therefore the criminal means are justified by the righteous end. We discussed earlier one rather famous and infamous illustration of that, which was Pearl Harbor, and how that terrific crime had been completely condoned by the apologists for Roosevelt and Marshall as being justified because of their wonderful purpose. Caravatiglia wrote his Arthashastra in about 300 BC. Machiavelli wrote his Il Principe in about 1600 AD. And the argument of both that it is a virtue in a ruler to be unscrupulous for the good of his state was heard before the first and in between the two after the last one has been heard in every age. Fourth, government is always and inevitably an enemy of individual freedom. It seems rather strange at first sight until you understand Woodrow Wilson better. Seems rather strange that it was Wilson who more than any other one man started this nation on its present road towards totalitarianism, who also said that the history of human liberty is a history of the limitations of governmental power, not the increase of it. But Wilson could have boasted, as did Charles II of England, that he said only wise things, although he did only foolish ones. You may remember, it's worth commenting, it's, I think, one of the great illustrations of repartee in history, what Charles's answer to that was. Somebody wrote an epitaph for Charles II while he was still alive. Here lies our sovereign Lord the King, whose word no man relies on, who never says a foolish thing, nor ever does a wise one. And Charles came back at once and said, yes, that's absolutely true, because my words are my own, but my acts are those of my ministers. It's quite clever. But anyway, Woodrow Wilson could have boasted that he never said a foolish thing and never did a wise one. It is self-evident that government, by its very nature, must be an enemy of freedom, edging always towards a restriction of the individual's rights and responsibilities. 5. Whatever must be done by government will always cost more than if it could be done by individuals or smaller groups. And the larger the government, the more disproportionate will be the cost. Letting a government do anything, therefore, which individuals or smaller groups could properly do is serious economic wastefulness. It is also contrary to the philosophy of the proper function of government that is derived from the whole body of past experiments. Incidentally, the Catholic Church, and as you know, I'm not a Catholic, but the Catholic Church has learned a great deal from so many centuries of experience. They have a very fundamental principle here that's very important that applies, called the principle of subsidiarity, which is never have a larger group do anything that a smaller group can do. If an individual can do it, don't have a committee or a group. If a small group can, don't have a bigger one. Always have the smallest group that can do any job, do it. Have I stated that correctly, Lorene? And it's a wonderful principle, and I wish we could get it completely, absolutely applied to governments. 6, government, by its size, its momentum, and its authority, will not only perpetuate errors of doctrine or of policy longer than they would otherwise retain acceptance, but it will multiply the effect of these errors on a geometric scale, as against the arithmetically cumulative effect of those errors if confined to individuals or smaller groups. The errors of tens of thousands of individuals, all thinking and probing in different directions and moved by different impulses, tend to cancel themselves out or to be softened by the attrition of doubt and disagreement. But let any one error become sanctified by government and thus crystallized as truth, and little short of a revolution can discredit it or cause it to be discarded. An easy illustration of this principle is the witchcraft terror in the early days of the colonial government of Massachusetts. If there had been no governmental power to give phantasmagoria the semblance of reality by official decree, the common sense of a majority of the citizens would have kept this manifestation of fanaticism from ever having such widespread support and cruel results. But once government had authoritatively said, "This is truth," then the hitherto doubting citizen was willing to join others like himself in accepting it as truth. And we have, ladies and gentlemen, at least a dozen idiocies equally repugnant to man's common sense and sound experience being perpetuated by our government in Washington today. Now, 2 or 3 years ago, a group like this, a little larger, at the Welch Country Club in Los Angeles, I made the same statement, and sitting in the second row was Eck Heaston, the congressman, very great congressman, a great American. And when I made that statement that there were at least a dozen idiocies as bad as the witchcraft era being perpetrated in Washington today, he shot his hand up and he said, "Bob, name one." I said, "Sure, foreign aid." He said, "You win." And you stop and think of it. The witchcraft horror caused the death of a few very unfortunate women, maybe 24 at the most. It was a super nonsense. Our foreign aid super nonsense has been directly responsible for the torture and death by atrocities of hundreds of thousands of people, and I mean it. It's far more idiotic than was the witchcraft craze, and has been far more disastrous and cruel in its effect. And you've got a dozen of them, if you look for them, being perpetrated in Washington today. 7. As any society becomes reasonably settled and shakes down into a semi-permanent pattern of economic and political life, and as some degree of leisure on the part of its citizens becomes both possible and visible, the drive always begins to have government become the management of the social enterprise rather than merely its agent for certain clear purposes. Government is then increasingly allowed, invited, and even urged to do planning for and exercise control over the total economy of the nation. Next, government is pushed and pushes itself more and more into planning and control of the separate activities of the citizens and groups of citizens that make up the economic life of the nation. And in doing such planning and exercising such controls, the government must assume more and more of the responsibility for the success of the economy and the welfare of its citizens. Now, of course, no government, short of being omniscient, can ever plan the specialized division of labor and the beneficial interchange of the various products of human effort, or can ever appraise the impact of changing circumstances and changing desires on the infinite ramifications of interrelated human activity one half as well as the planning, appraisal, and resulting corrections will be accomplished by a completely free market if given the opportunity. For the free market automatically weighs, measures, and integrates into its decisions increments of need, of difficulty, and of motivation that are too small, too numerous, and too hidden for the planners ever to discover them. And the equations to be dealt with are too infinite to be resolved by any human brain or committee of human brains, even if all the variables and constants could be accurately set forth in such equations. A government, ladies and gentlemen, trying to step in and improve the workings of a free market is exactly like a man who takes a lighted lantern outdoors at noon of a bright June day to show you the sun. But a government's answer to any criticism as to the folly and inadequacy of the lantern is always to bring more lanterns and then more lanterns, until eventually the smoke and glare of the lanterns so seriously interfere with and shut off the light of the sun that everybody does actually have to work mainly by lantern light after all. That's the story of controls in one government after another, going back to at least 17 or 1800 BC, that we can see it and observe it and study it. It is interesting to note, too, that in any society, the government and its allies who want to use these lanterns of control always claim the justification that the society's economy is more complex than those which have preceded it. They insist that, therefore, the lanterns of planning and control are necessary and helpful now, no matter how futile and harmful they have been shown to be in the past. Now, there's many books I would like to write. Some of them I was going to if I hadn't got involved in my present job. There's many pamphlets and many speeches I'd like to put together, and many even skits. I'll never get a chance. Most of you probably know Keats's famous line, "When I have fears that I may cease to be," when he goes on to talk about all the things he wants to write and will never have a chance to do. He's afraid. And of course he didn't, because he died at 26, but I've outlived him. Anyway, there's all kinds I'd like to write. I'll never get a chance. But one that I'd certainly enjoy writing would be a conversation in about 60 A.D. between a Roman senator and his millionaire friend at the friend's summer home at Pompeii. And they're sitting on the patio at Pompeii of this millionaire's home, and they are talking. And the senator says, "Yes, my good friend, I know I'm not the ignoramus that you assume all of us Roman senators are. I've been around, and I have, as you probably really know, I have visited Egypt, and I've studied some of their past so far as they know it, and I've been to Babylon and studied the history of the Babylonian empires, both the earlier one and the later one. And I've certainly studied the history of Greece, which is very important in this picture. And I realize that government controls have been dismal failures and have had a lot to do with the decline of these economies of these nations. I know that the Babylonian Empire was practically ruined by Hammurabi's code. I'm aware of that. I know the Greek story right here next to us and fairly recent, that government controls instituted by the various tyrants of the city-states ruined the economy of Greece. But gee, my good man, what you don't realize is how much more complicated is our industry and our economy today. Today we have roads that run to all parts of the known world, and we are gathering in supplies by chariot from all these parts of the world, and we are shipping out artifacts that are being manufactured here in Rome, and we have an infinitely more complicated civilization and economy. So today, because of these greater complications, we simply must have these controls. It's necessary, despite the fact that they have been very harmful in the economies of the past. And you could write that with care and word it, and you could then, when you got through, swear it was something that Adlai Stevenson had been saying. You couldn't tell the difference, except changing a few names, and it would be exactly the same and would have applied exactly at that time. But of course, exactly the opposite of what this Roman senator would have been saying is true. Exactly. The more complex the economic life of a nation becomes, the more nearly infinite the shades and grades of impulse which determine the proper interchanges and relationships between its components become, then the more impossible and ridiculous is any undertaking to plan and control those relationships, and the more the automatic working of a completely free market is needed. Number 8. As a government increases in power, and as a means of increasing its power, it always has a tendency to squeeze out the middle class, to destroy or weaken the middle for the benefit of the top and the bottom, even where there is no conscious alliance for this purpose, such as formed the basis for Bismarck's beginning of the socialization of Germany, of Franklin Roosevelt's beginning of the socialization of America. The forces to that end, nevertheless, are always at work, as they have been in England for over 50 years. In the nations that the gods would destroy, they first make the middle class helpless through insidious but irresistible government pressures and controls.